Welcome back to our another Voices in Rewilding series. So today we're joined by Benedict Macdonald. So the first thing we're going to ask you, just tell me a bit about yourself.
Thanks. Thank you for having me. Nice to be here. I'm Benedict Macdonald, founding director of Restore, one of the UK's specialist rewilding organisations. I'm a lifelong naturalist, so from a very early age I was captivated by birds, butterflies, starting here in the UK. As a profession, I was very fortunate to work for 10 years as one of Sir David Attenborough's television directors, so it was exposed to some of the most chaotic, replete, interesting landscapes, environments, ecosystems across the world, and developed a real growing concern as to the kind of the poverty and silence of the British landscape and the species that I was growing up with that were becoming considerably more and more rare: cuckoos, willow tits, turtle doves, and then increasingly interested in all the ones that had already gone extinct, which is quite a long list. And off the back of that, wrote my first book, Rewilding, which kind of set out a vision for what British wildlife could be at its maximal extent and how we lost it and how we could get it back. Orchard, co-written with my good friend Nicholas Gates, a book about farming and living within nature, and Cornerstones, a book about keystone species and the roles that they play, some of them quite well known, like the beaver, others less well known, like the role of whales in the oceans, the historical role that whales, WH, would have played in the British Isles. So from that, and a growing interest in natural capital markets and ways of monetizing rewilding, the aim not of profiteering, but of scaling, of making rewilding accessible to farmers and landowners, taking them on this journey, we founded Restore.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. The fact that you've had the privilege to work with someone like David Attenborough, and then go off and write your own books about something you're really interested in.
It's been a very, very fortunate career in many ways. The last 2 years have undoubtedly been the hardest. Setting up a business from scratch is and then maintaining it is not without challenge. You've got your equity raising hat on, your employment hat on, your client creation hat on. You have to wear lots of new hats all at once.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Dive into setting up a rewilding business, but it's been thoroughly worth it.
Definitely. So how do you see rewilding fitting alongside more traditional land management approaches?
Extremely well, I think. So if we were to look at Britain today without its deer estates and grouse moors and in some cases upland farming, we would select areas of highly productive soils, often in the lowlands, for the production of various forms of fruit, vegetables, not merely the corn and wheat that we appear to have such vast quantities of in the countryside. And we would allocate those more hillier, remote areas, poor quality, grade 5, grade 4 soils for extensive grazing or for the preservation of nature. Of course, the nature in Britain is almost all, bar small areas of the New Forest, the Malvern Chases, a few other areas been taken away. So therefore needs to be actively put back. So we're not a campaign organisation. We're a business that services the growing need and wish of landowners to restore ecosystems on their land. And unsurprisingly, we always find that it's mutually agreed that the areas that are the least agriculturally productive are the most suited to rewilding, and the very agriculturally productive areas remain productive agriculturally, but could be enhanced through reduced dependence upon chemicals, re-wetting field edges, reinstating ponds, hedgerows, and those more conventional land management techniques. The living example that we use of can this work is the South Hill estate in Bedfordshire. It's an 11,000 acre estate, 4,000 acres going on a nature restoration journey. That's both restructuring of existing woodlands and creation of new scrub grasslands and wetlands in areas that were grade 4 and grade 5, whereas the more agriculturally productive areas remain producing a wide array of crops, including orchard, vineyard, a huge array of different food types being produced, not just food volume. Is a really interesting point that often gets missed. Are we eating the right food for our microbiome? But maybe we'll come on to that later. And you can do both, but you do need scale, which is normally why Restore works above 1,000 acres, because then you have the optionality to do both rewilding and nature-friendly farming in many cases.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so definitely sort of fitting the two together works really well, like you were saying, on the slightly bigger scale projects as well.
It can do, but it can also work even on a smaller scale. You'll find that every farm manager has a rude name for at least a couple of fields on their
Hmm.
land that they've always hated farming. And the only reason they've bothered is because they were paid per acre or per output under the Common Agricultural Policy and so on and so forth. Whereas now, of course, with biodiversity net gain and with natural capital markets, it can often be much more profitable to take that land, which never wanted to be farmed, was always resisting being conventionally farmed, and to take it back into wetland. So even on smaller farms, this model can still work.
Yeah, so sort of bringing on to that topic actually about landowners, what role do you think landowners should play in supporting rewilding, and how do you think they can help land and river restoration?
Well, really, they have to play the biggest role because in Britain at the moment, unless we embrace a fairly aggressive form of socialism, then most
Hmm.
land in Britain is privately managed. Even in national parks, they're not really national because most of the land within national parks is privately owned and privately managed. I
Yeah.
think 1.5% of land is held by NGOs and a smaller percentage then, of course, by a few state owned bodies, for Forestry England, for example, but the vast
Hmm.
majority of British land is privately owned. So landowners have to play the biggest role, and that is exactly why Restore was set up to scale rewilding. Our own managed portfolios at 80,000 acres that we've grown in 2 years, because there is this extraordinary groundswell of positive change, particularly from younger landowners, landowners less encumbered by tradition, kind of power couples in farming. We find tend to just, people with quite simple management structures where their hands aren't tied by too many estate managers or
Hmm.
family trusts, really keen to just get nature back on their land fast. So, but you touched briefly on catchments. I think it's really interesting. One of our partners, Rebalance Earth, are funding the Even Load catchment project run by Tim Field and Co. and Great Yellow, another nature restoration organisation that sprung up in the recent years, looking at restoring at a catchment scale, and I think that's really important as well because there's only so much a landowner can do unless it's a Grosvenor level estate of 25,000 acres or whatever. A river runs through the land of multiple parties, dozens of parties, sometimes hundreds of parties' land, and you need to have a catchment level joined up approach that really allows for that entire catchment to be repaired.
Yeah. So you were saying about the river sort of going through many different owners of land and things like that. So do you reckon working together and sort of sharing their tactics is something that can really help?
It has to be the case. There's a fluctuating appetite. You'll often find in a farm cluster there might be a few radical early pioneer thinkers who want to go the whole
Hmm.
way with beavers and riparian
Yeah.
restoration. Then there'll be other more conservative voices who might still come in 20 meters either side of a river. It's not a perfect science, and we are bluntly making a lot of this up as we go along because the restoration of the British countryside is still quite a new activity at scale.
Mm.
Um, but widespread cooperation between landowners works best where there's a common enemy, and the common enemy is flooding in many cases
Mhm.
because nobody wants flooding. The farmers alive today weren't the ones who canalised the rivers. That was often done in Victorian times.
Yeah.
They are suffering the consequences. Nobody can affect now, really, how much rain comes out of the sky. What we can affect is what happens to the rain when it hits the catchment. So, rewiggling rivers, if wild beaver releases, but occasionally, if that's seen as a bit radical, leaky woody dams and other
Mhm.
structures that slow the flow. Normally, if you're preventing land downstream getting flooded, you get quite a positive response. Ironically, if you use the word rewilding, the response varies depending on who the audience is and
Yeah.
what preconceptions they have around that word and
Mhm.
around what that word means.
So they've definitely got the trickier job then. It wasn't them that necessarily created the issue, but they've got to fix it, unfortunately, which is never ideal.
Exactly. Well, they, yes, but they shouldn't ever be expected to find the capital to fix it. So a really important part of our
Mm.
model is by making rewilding accessible to everyone through channeling investment, pension funds, other um, family office investments into the
Mhm.
rewilding process, carrying out the rewilding activity, and then selling natural capital as a way to pay back the investment is allowing us to scale without having to say to landowners, you're going to have to dig into your own pockets, because often landowners are asset rich, cash
Yeah.
poor. Some of them can invest in the process, but many
Mhm.
others need either money from the government, money from the private sector, or both.
Yeah. Which, of course, that probably puts people off again if they're having to fund it themselves. So, like you were saying, giving them the funding can definitely sort of help more people get involved. So from your,
Exactly.
sorry, go on. So from your experience, what type of rewilding approach tends to work well and why?
We take a systems-led approach where we don't target a single species, we target the maximal ecological complexity that we can create, because that is what would have been there
Mhm.
in the old days, so to speak. We place a huge focus on abundance. Bioabundance is perhaps the greatest missing ingredient in the British countryside. If you might recall speaking to one of your grandparents, or reading old historical accounts from Victorian times, butterflies used to be a in the tens of thousands phenomenon. Spotted
Mm.
flycatchers used to be in every village. Cuckoos were in every village because they were used as the harbinger of spring. And these all of these species have collapsed mainly, not exclusively, due to a lack of habitat complexity, so the complex scrub, wetland habitats in proximity to one another, but above all, a collapse in the abundance of invertebrates. So,
Mhm.
as I discovered when writing Rebirding, a single cuckoo needs 90,000 hairy caterpillars to get one bird through the summer. So, when you look at the devastating impacts of herbicide, of agricultural tidiness, of the removal of thorn, of willow being taken out of farmland, all of these things remove the moth caterpillars, and all of those things remove the cuckoos. So
Mhm.
what we're trying to do is build these systems from the bottom up. So that's the kind of key ethos: is restore soil, botanical complexity, invertebrate bioabundance. Then you don't need specific action plans for birds. They come back by themselves. On the South Hill estate, our mass landscape action has been the culling of thousands of non-native Chinese water deer and muntjac deer. And
Mhm.
that's created a vegetation pulse, which has created the moth caterpillars. So we're now seeing big resurgences in cuckoo, in grasshopper warbler, in stone chat, in all of these red listed species, without targeting the needs of a particular species. So if you get the system right, everything else follows in our view and in our experience.
Mm. So how do you decide whether a rewilding project has been successful, and what monitoring do you put in place to measure it over time?
With the inevitable caveat, it's too early to say. There are
Mhm.
two answers to that. The informal answer is, once it's working, you know, because there is a riot of sound and life that just goes up and up. So when you start walking through a restored grassland, you're seeing hundreds, thousands of meadow brown butterflies. When I walked around South Hill
Mm.
Estate last year, we're not yet seeing the full biodiversity of butterflies, some of which may need to be put back because they've completely vanished from the wider landscape. But we were seeing butterflies in their tens of thousands. Common
Mm.
species: peacocks, small white, large white, meadow brown, gatekeeper, Essex, common, small skipper. Um, and that can be discerned and measured. The
Mhm.
more formal answer is that our ecology department quantifies almost everything. It's very difficult to quantify every element of biodiversity uplift. So we look
Yeah,
at
of course.
sampled increases in biodiversity, bioabundance, and structural change, because you can measure structural change. If you're
Mhm.
flying a high quality drone, so if you're using a drone to capture high quality imagery of your
Mhm.
rewilding site month by month, you cannot escape the fact that what was once a square field has transformed into a complex wetland. The activities of beavers, very obvious from the air. The emergence of scrub, the transformation of pea green, nitrate rich grasslands to kind of golden nitrate poor, as in, natural grassland. All of this
Yeah.
could be measured and quantified. One of the key natural capital mechanisms that we use is called the Restore 30 by 30 unit, where we get corporates to invest directly into rewilding activity. So they could bring their employees down to see the rewilding. It sits on their balance sheet as an ESG investment. But what they're effectively sponsoring is 30 square meters of rewilding activity every year. And we provide them with the data to show that that activity is real, it's happening, it's not greenwash, it's quantifiable. And then on top of that, at an estate level, we're looking at bioabundance and biodiversity.
That's got to be something that's quite special to see is completing a project and then seeing the wildlife slowly coming back in, like you were saying, the more butterflies and beavers and things. So it's got to be something that's quite nice to see.
I've never completed a project and I never will because I'll be dead before they're completed, and that's not actually meant to be a
Yeah.
flippant statement. But the rewilding projects. I mean, the great thing in southern England is within even a couple of years you've got that extraordinary change. Last year at
Mm.
South Hill Estate, lapwings, curlew, short-eared owl finding the site. We had no idea a short-eared owl would discover a site in Bedfordshire because there are no short-eared owls breeding in Bedfordshire these days. So you get
Yeah.
all these wonderful surprises as well. Whether the journey is ever truly complete, I mean, we, from a business perspective, we do 10-year management contracts. By the end of the 10 years, we hope the landscape is on a route to full transformation. Of course,
Mhm.
that 500-year-old oak tree, there's nothing we can do to chivvy that along, but we can certainly create the scrub through which the oak tree grows.
Yeah. That's probably another thing actually is knowing, like you were saying, you do the 10 years and hope that's sort of on track. Is that there's probably no necessary end to a project because there's always more you could be doing. There's always more, species you could bring back in and things. So maybe like you were saying, it's tricky to know when a project is complete.
It is. I mean, there are the number of barometers. Obviously, there's the if for our rewilding clients, there's the client satisfaction, there's what our data shows,
Mm.
and then there were the active interventions that follow habitat restoration. So once you've got a very complex scrub grassland with towering blackthorn, in year 15, you might want to look at a reintroduction of the black hair streak butterfly, for example, or the black
Mhm.
vein white, but species that can't recolonize by themselves because they become extinct at such a large scale in the British landscape. In our Lincolnshire project, we'll probably in the first 7 years be looking at the restoration of complex ant-rich grassland with grazing animals, and then we might look at the reintroduction of the Mazarin blue butterfly, which has a commensurate relationship with ants. But first, the
Mm.
ants need to be there. So there's always more that you can do. And I mean, in northern England, we're looking at acquiring a site where, maybe in 15 years' time, that site will be suitable for the reintroduction of the Eurasian lynx. So I suppose I was told once employee satisfaction at Google is so high because the mission is endless. And I think we kind of find the same at Restore
Yeah.
in a smaller way.
So what do you think is the biggest barrier to people implementing rewilding more commonly?
Finance. I
Mhm.
think there are genuine cultural um, barriers, self-imposed barriers. There are areas where people believe what they're already doing is great. If you really think driven grouse shooting is fantastic for nature, you are not going to do something else because you think you are already at the zenith of your ecological power, I suppose. But
Mm.
mostly, I would say finance. I mean, our great breakthrough at Restore has been unlocking hundreds of thousands, occasionally millions of pounds of finance for our clients from the private sector, which has allowed us to proceed with certainty and absorb the opportunity cost. Because when you're pivoting 1,000 acres of even failing arable, at least there's a known quantity to the yield. You've got your assets and your farm machinery. So the economic pivot can be quite complex from business as usual towards rewilding activity. And
Mhm.
often landowners are scared by doing all of that, selling off assets, winding down the traditional operation, waiting for the natural capital to sell. So when we launched Restore Finance last year, the aim is that every project from now on that we manage is front financed, which
Mhm.
de-risks the entire process. And suddenly we're now working with some fantastic farmers in Wiltshire who, aside from owning the land, have no spare capital to invest and make that transition themselves. So we're
Yeah.
looking to get that transition funded through pension fund investment,
Hmm.
which is a capitalist mechanism that expects a return, but it allows us to commence the process with confidence. So I would say finance is the biggest blocker.
Yeah. But at least the way you're doing it means that a lot more people can get involved, even if, like you were saying, they haven't necessarily got the cash there. It's more tied up in assets and everything like that. So it definitely allows more people to get involved.
That's
Um,
the aim, and I think if we had one or two in every county talking to their local National Farmers Union representative, talking to the clusters, proving that, you can arrive these days, you can raise £1 million, invest it into a project, carry out the rewilding activity, sell the natural capital, make it profitable, often much more profitable than some of the failing big agricultural models that we see, then a lot more people are going to copy it.
hmm. So alongside doing a rewilding project, what's the additional benefits you commonly see?
Increases in happiness, lack of stress. It's
Yeah.
not a flippant statement. Um, Intensive farming is unbelievably stressful,
Mm.
particularly farming arable these days, because your main enemy is the weather, plus the rising cost of all of the fungicides and herbicides that you're using to try and control the operation. Then you've got
Yeah.
your machinery costs, the fact that your sons and daughters don't want to go into it, so they're leaving, they're going off to the city. Um, Younger people are much more interested in putting life back now than in
Mhm.
taking it away. So when you begin rewilding a site, there's an enormous, I mean, I'm biased because I work with all the ones who are most passionate about it, right? But there's an enormous sense of relief when that really inefficient, often loss-making, complex, big agricultural system, intensive agricultural system is killed off and replaced
Mm.
with something that's more holistic and more meaningful and more self-sustaining as well. A lot of our, sites use grazing, but those animals, they don't have any feed attached. We're not growing any maize to get them through the winter. They're living off the landscape. So that creates much more low maintenance, harmonious structure, not just for the
Mhm.
animals, but for those looking after the animals. So a general increase in the well-being of the people carrying it out. I mean, at South Hill Estate, the owner, Mr. Whitbread, I mean, he's just jumping up and down with enthusiasm, as is the gamekeeper, who's supposed to be a traditional enemy of rewilding, our most
Mm.
impactful person on the ground in the entire Restore portfolio is a gamekeeper, and he's delighted because he's putting his old traditional skills to new use.
Mhm.
I think educational benefit. Our incredible commercial director Gil Martin used to run the Belmont Estate rewilding project near Clifton in Bristol, getting kids from inner city schools to come and see their first, pig snouting around and understanding the role of that animal in the ecosystem. And yes, it does get eaten at the end, but it's this
Mm.
kind of cycle of life. I mean, rewilding has immense visible educational benefits. So that's a really important thing for us. And I think also by keeping younger people in the countryside, we restore and playing a small role, but we the rewilding community are playing a really important role in keeping that average age down. Your average age of an intensive farmer 65 now plus in many areas, upland Wales 70, and
Mm.
younger people are not going into any form of land management, whether farming or rewilding, or in our case, that sort of fusion model that we carry out. So it's really important that we don't have our entire population ending up living in big cities because I think it's just socially unsustainable.
Yeah.
And who's going to look after the land? This is the point. If you just abandon land, it doesn't rewild itself very well. Not in this country. It would do in Africa because the elephants move into it and they bring the seeds and they dig the ponds themselves. But in Britain, it's quite rewilding is quite an active activity. It requires a
Mhm.
lot of human ingenuity and resource to make it viable.
Yeah.
So we keep people on the land. Intensive farming pushes them off it, and I think that's one of the most powerful things I would advocate for in rewilding.
I think that links quite nicely to the last question, actually, which would be for someone starting out in the industry, what would be one piece of advice you'd give them?
I would say treat this as a serious profession and a business opportunity. Don't treat it as a charitable opportunity. And I'm not saying don't go and work for the wildlife trusts or heal rewilding. There are fantastic people out there doing. Craig Bennett and his team are doing incredible things at the wildlife trust. But I run a private business where we have shareholders, we have investors, we have a performance-based structure. It's ostensibly a normal high performance specialized business
Yeah.
that is doing rewilding because those are the values of the founder and everyone who works with us. But it's not a kind of charitable enterprise where we're just rattling the bucket and hoping people give us some money. It's now a normalized, scaled business offering. I want to see courses in Royal Agricultural College where people realise that rewilding is now a profession. We've got enough other companies out there, Nattergal, Oxygen Conservation, Environment Bank, Great Yellow, all of whom are also private businesses scaling rewilding. So it's a really exciting time to come into the sector. And there are way more opportunities now for, you know, well-paid, rewarding work in the sector than even five years ago when none of us existed.
Yeah. I think as well, like you were mentioning earlier about bringing people to the Belmont estate and things can be really good. Gives them the experience which they might have not otherwise had, and hopefully inspires them to go into the industry and take on your advice, like you mentioned.
Well, hopefully. I think demonstration sites are really important. So obviously at Southwood Estate, we show around lots of people from Natural England and the RSPB. Seeing is believing, I think.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Well, thank you for this. That was really insightful. It's been great to speak to you.